The message came at 10:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Not a call, a text. "We need to talk tonight." No name. Just a number Raven hadn't seen in 6 years. A number she'd deleted, blocked, and somehow still recognized the way you recognize the smell of a house you grew up in. Instantly, in your stomach, before your brain even catches up. She was sitting in her car in the Frostbank Tower parking garage, still in her work clothes, halfway through a breakfast taco she'd been saving since noon. Her husband had just left her a voicemail that made her laugh so hard she almost choked. He'd spent 4 minutes trying to describe a TV show he'd seen and couldn't remember the title of, mixing up his English and Korean so badly that by the end of it she still had no idea what show he was talking about, but she'd played it 3 times anyway. That was 60 seconds ago. Life was fine. Life was actually really good. And then the text. She stared at it, took another bite of her taco, chewed slowly. Because Raven Jones had spent enough of her life letting fear make her move fast, and she'd promised herself a long time ago she wasn't doing that anymore. Then the passenger door opened. She hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't seen anyone approach. 1 second the seat was empty, and the next second there was a man in it, and the casual, practiced ease with which he settled in, like he'd done this 100 times, like he knew she wouldn't scream. Told her everything she needed to know about who he still was. Damon Wyatt, 6 years older. Still wearing that smile that looked like confidence from far away, and like something else entirely up close. Raven didn't scream. She looked at him the way you look at something that crawled in under the door. Not afraid, just tired that it got in. "You look good," he said. "San Antonio treated you well." Damon, her voice was flat. "You have 30 seconds to explain why you're in my car before I start screaming and ruin your whole evening." He laughed. The same laugh. Like everything was a game he was already winning. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen twice and held it up. The folder was organized, neat, labeled by date, photos she recognized, video thumbnails she hadn't seen in 6 years, documents with a club name on them, Mirage, and her old stage name printed underneath it like evidence. He'd been building this. He hadn't just found her. He'd been preparing. 8 months, he said quietly, scrolling with his thumb. Utsa, junior year. You were good at it too, from what I remember. He paused on one thumbnail. Wonder what Lee Jung-kook's business partners think about that. Wonder what the women in his family think. Korean billionaire families are traditional, right? Very concerned about reputation. Raven was quiet. 500,000, Damon said, wired. 48 hours and all of this disappears. You go back to your beautiful life in Olmos Park, and I go away and everybody's happy. He said it like he was doing her a favor. She picked her taco back up and took a bite. "Get out of my car, Damon," he smiled wider. Stood up from the seat, adjusted his jacket, looked down at her like he'd already won. 48 hours, Raven. "Tell that husband of yours I said hello." And he walked away into the dark of the garage, footsteps echoing, completely unhurried. A man who had done this before and expected the same result he always got. Silence, fear, money. Raven sat there for 30 seconds after he disappeared. Then she picked up her phone and called one number. It rang once. Jagia, Jung-kook's voice, steady and warm. "You okay? He found me," she said. 2 seconds of silence, just 2. "I know," he said. "Come home." Now before we go any further, if you're already hooked, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe, because this story is about to go places you are absolutely not ready for. To understand what that phone call meant, you have to understand who Raven Jones actually was before she became Raven Jones Lee. She grew up on the east side of San Antonio, oldest of 4. Her mother, Carol, worked double shifts at a care home 6 days a week and still sometimes came up short on rent. Not because she was irresponsible, because the math just didn't work. It genuinely, consistently, stubbornly did not work. And Raven understood that by the time she was 9 years old. She was the one who made sure her siblings ate before she did. She was the one who packed lunches and checked homework and learned how to make a meal out of whatever was in the cabinet, because complaining about the cabinet didn't fill it. She did all of this without making it feel like a burden, which was its own kind of skill. The skill of making survival look like a choice. She was also, for the record, absolutely hilarious. Her siblings would say the same thing. She could make their mother laugh on the hardest days. She had this ability to find the absurdity in terrible situations and hold it up to the light until everyone in the room could see it too. It was not a coping mechanism. It was just who she was, someone who understood that humor and hardship were not opposites. She got a partial scholarship to UTSA, worked 2 jobs through freshman and sophomore year. Then junior year, her mother had a medical scare, not fatal, but the kind of medical situation that generates paperwork, that generates bills, that generate a specific kind of panic that doesn't go away by ignoring it. The math stopped working again, except this time the numbers were bigger and Raven was the only one who could see them clearly. A girl in her dorm told her about Mirage. Raven stood outside that club for 20 minutes the first night. Just stood there on the sidewalk, not moving. A woman at the door saw her standing there, came outside and said something Raven never forgot. You don't have to be ashamed. You're just surviving. We're all just surviving. 8 months. She meant it when she said 8 months, and she kept that promise to herself. She paid her mother's bills. She kept her siblings in school. She graduated with honors, got her MBA, built a career in urban development consulting that took her to Chicago, then New York, then Seoul on a contract project that changed everything. Seoul was never supposed to be permanent. It was a 4-month contract, a mixed-use development presentation for a consortium of investors that her firm had landed. And Raven was sent because she was the best they had at walking into a room full of people who didn't think they needed her and making them realize they did. She was mid-presentation when the questions started. Most of the investors asked soft questions, the kind people ask when they're performing interest without actually having it. But one man in the back of the room kept asking real ones, the kind that told her he'd actually read the proposal, the kind that pushed back not to challenge her, but because he genuinely wanted to understand the thinking behind a decision she'd made on page 32. His name was Lee Jung-kook. He didn't look the way she expected a Korean billionaire to look. She wasn't sure what she'd expected exactly, but it wasn't someone who took notes by hand in a regular notebook, or who waited until everyone else had left the room before he came to ask her one last question. The question was about a zoning decision she'd made in the proposal. He thought there was a smarter way to approach it. He was right. She told him he was right. He looked mildly surprised, like he wasn't used to that. "Coffee?" he said. "I don't drink coffee, tea, or just the conversation." She laughed. He smiled. That was the beginning of everything. 6 months of him flying between Seoul and wherever she was. Phone calls at strange hours because of time zones neither of them complained about. Him learning that she communicated best when she was moving. Best conversations happened on walks, never sitting still. Her learning that he processed things quietly before he spoke, and that the silence before his answer was never emptiness. It was him taking her seriously enough to think before he responded. She'd never had that before. Someone who thought before they answered her. He flew to San Antonio to meet her family. He sat at her mother Carol's kitchen table in a regular shirt. No performance, no showing off. Just sat down like a man who understood that this table was the most important room he would ever walk into. Her youngest brother Kev tried to sell him fundraiser car wash tickets. Jung-kook bought 50 without hesitating. Kev looked at the cash, looked at Raven and mouthed keep him. 3 weeks after that trip, Jung-kook called her and said, "I want to talk about the future, our future. But first I want to know if there's anything you want to tell me, anything at all. I'm asking because I want you to know that whatever it is, I'm still going to be right here." She thought he was fishing for something specific. She almost said nothing, but something about the way he asked, not curious, not suspicious, just open, made her decide. She told him everything, the East Side, the bills, the 8 months at Mirage, the stage name, the relationship with Damon Wyatt that started as manipulation she didn't recognize until she was already inside it, and the way Damon used what he knew to keep her quiet and compliant and ashamed long after it ended. She told him about the night she finally left, about the threats that followed for a while before they went quiet, about the 5 years she spent assuming the silence meant it was over. She told him all of it with her eyes open, braced the entire time for the conversation to shift, for his voice to change, for the question that would tell her he was already calculating an exit. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then he said, "Thank you for trusting me with that." And then, and this was the thing she would think about for years, he asked her what her siblings' names were. Like he wanted to know her whole life, not just the complicated parts of it. They got engaged 4 months later. What Raven did not know was that 2 weeks after she told him about Damon, before the engagement, Jung-kook had made one quiet phone call to the head of his private security division. Not about her, about Damon Wyatt. Now back in the present, Raven pulled into the driveway of their Olmos Park home just after 11 p.m. It was a craftsman-style house. Sturdy, rooted, with the big backyard and a bedroom on the ground floor because Raven had said when they bought it that her mother needed to be able to visit without climbing stairs. Jung-kook had signed the papers the same day. He was in the kitchen when she walked in, jacket off, sleeves pushed up, 2 cups of chamomile tea already on the counter, because he knew she'd need it and he'd known she was coming home to a hard conversation. She dropped her bag, looked at him, he looked back. "Sit down," he said. "I'll tell you what I know." She opened the folder slowly. It was thin, clean. The kind of document that had been put together by people who knew what they were doing and weren't trying to impress anyone with volume, just precision. Damon Wyatt, 38. Financial history that looked normal on the surface and collapsed the moment you pulled the thread. Failed businesses, quiet settlements, LLCs that opened and closed in short cycles. A specific company registered in Dallas 3 years ago that existed, as far as anyone could tell, for one purpose. Storage and monetization of material obtained without consent. There were names in the folder, women, 4 of them, each with a timeline that looked almost identical. A relationship, a vulnerability, a period of silence after it ended, and then contact. A demand, a payment in most cases, or a public exposure in the cases where payment didn't come. And at the bottom of the 3rd page, a notation from 18 months ago. Damon Wyatt had attempted to locate Raven Jones after seeing her name and photograph in a Korean business publication that covered Jung-kook's development group. He'd been looking for her for a year and a half. Raven looked up from the folder. "When did you do this?" she said. 2 weeks after you told me about him, before the engagement." She set the folder down carefully. "You investigated my past. I investigated the man who hurt you," he said. "There's a difference." She wanted to argue with that distinction. She sat with it instead. He explained quietly. Early in their relationship, before she told him anything, he'd noticed things. The way she'd go still when financial stress came up in conversation. Not sad, just braced. Like someone who'd learned that money problems had physical consequences. The way she'd double-check bills and accounts even when there was no reason to. The way she'd sometimes look at her own success with a slight wariness, like she was watching it from a distance, not quite inside it. He loved her too much to pretend he hadn't noticed. So when she finally told him about Damon, he didn't just accept it and move forward. He had his security team build a complete picture, not of Raven, but of the threat. What they found was larger than one incident of blackmail. It was a pattern, a system. A man who had built a quiet, profitable operation on the shame of women he'd deliberately made vulnerable. Jung-kook had been waiting 3 years for Damon to surface. "You never told me," Raven said. Her voice was careful. "I didn't want you spending 3 years looking over your shoulder," he said. "You deserve to actually live." She stood up and walked to the kitchen window. Outside, the San Antonio night was warm and still. She could hear a neighbor's dog somewhere down the street. She stood there long enough that Jung-kook didn't try to fill the silence. Then she turned around. "Okay," she said, "I have a plan. And mine is better than whatever legal route you're thinking." For the first time that night, he smiled. "Okay, tell me." Raven didn't sleep that night, not because she was afraid, she was past afraid. Fear had been useful to her exactly once in her life, the night she stood outside Mirage and felt it in her chest like a warning system, and she'd walked in anyway and survived. After that, fear just became noise, background static. She'd learned to think through it instead of waiting for it to stop. She sat at the kitchen table until 2 a.m. with a legal pad and a pen, not a laptop, because she thought better when her hand was moving, and she wrote down every angle. What Damon had, what he thought he had, what he didn't know she knew, what he didn't know Jung-kook knew, the 48-hour window and what it actually meant in terms of leverage and timeline, the women in that folder and what their silence had cost them, and what it would mean if even one of them decided the silence was over. By the time she put the pen down, she had something that wasn't a defense. It was a detonation. She called Simone Carter at 6 a.m. Simone was Raven's best friend, publicist, and the only person on earth who could outtalk her. They'd met in grad school, bonded over being the two black women in their program who refused to shrink themselves to make the room more comfortable, and had been impossible to separate ever since. Simone had built her PR firm from a two-person operation in a shared office to one of the most respected boutique agencies in Texas. She was sharp, direct, and had the specific quality Raven needed most right now. She did not panic. Talk, Simone said. She was already awake. Raven talked for a whiles. Laid it all out without emotion, just facts and sequence. When she was done, there was silence on the line. Raven knew Simone well enough to know she was calculating, not hesitating. There was a difference. You know what this does to your brand if we handle it wrong, Simone said. Destroys it temporarily, and if we handle it right, rebuilds it from bedrock, Raven said. And his goes with it. Another pause. I need 48 hours and a platform with real reach, Simone said. Can you write, Simone? I have a master's degree. Can you write honestly? That's different. Yes, then let's do it. The plan had 3 parts. First, a long-form personal essay. Raven's story, in her own words, submitted to a major outlet Simone had a relationship with. Not a confession, not a trauma dump. A clear, direct, first-person account of growing up on the East Side, of the 8 months at Mirage, of Damon Wyatt and exactly what he was and what he did. Written with the same voice Raven used when she was herself. Sharp, honest, and occasionally funny in ways that made the honesty land harder. Second, a podcast appearance ready to drop the same day as the essay. A show with a large enough audience to push the story past local news and into national conversation. Third, the women in Jung-kook's folder. 2 of them had already been contacted, carefully, by Jung-kook's legal team. When they heard someone with resources was ready to fight, not just survive, actually fight, both agreed to speak. Not anonymously, on record. Damon's operation ran entirely on silence. Every piece of this plan was designed to make silence structurally impossible. They called it internally the controlled burn. Raven spent 2 days writing the essay. She wrote it at the kitchen table, in the mornings before Jung-kook was up, in the quiet hours when the neighborhood was still settling and the light came through the window at an angle that made everything feel less urgent than it actually was. She wrote it carefully. She rewrote the Mirage section 4 times, not because she was ashamed, but because she wanted it to be exact. She wanted every person who read it to understand not just what happened but why, because why was the part that got left out of every version of this story that other people told about women like her. Jung-kook read the draft on the second morning, sat with it for a long time. When he looked up, his eyes were wet in a way he didn't try to hide. It's good, he said. I know, she said. It's really good, Raven. I know, she said again, but softer that time. They were 36 hours into the 48-hour window when everything went sideways. Raven's phone lit up at 4 a.m. on the second night, then again, then 4 times in quick succession. She was awake instantly. She'd been sleeping lightly, one ear always open, and she grabbed the phone and looked at the screen. Notifications, social media news alerts, her name. She sat up in bed and her stomach dropped before she'd even read a single full sentence. Because she could see enough from the previews to understand what had happened. The essay, her essay, pieces of it, not the whole thing. but enough were already circulating. Screenshots, the Mirage section, her name attached. Someone had leaked it. She was already out of bed and in the hallway, phone to her ear, calling Simone. "I see it," Simone said before Raven could speak. "Who?" "Working on it. Give me 10 minutes. It took 8, Cassidy Blake. A woman Raven had worked alongside for 3 years in the urban development world. Not a friend, not an enemy, just a colleague who'd always existed in Raven's peripheral vision as someone who smiled in the right moments and said the right things and had a specific quality about her that Raven had clocked but never named. The quality of someone who was quietly, consistently, deeply resentful of someone else's success while pretending not to be. Cassidy had access to a shared server from a project they'd both worked on. The draft had been in a folder Raven used across devices. Cassidy hadn't released it publicly herself. She wasn't quite bold enough for that. She'd sent it to 2 journalists as a heads-up, framing it as concern, letting them make the decision she didn't want accountability for. By 7 a.m., Raven's name was trending in San Antonio. Across town in a Pearl District hotel room, Damon Wyatt was awake and watching his phone. He'd been checking Google alerts on Raven's name every few hours since the parking garage, enjoying the window, imagining the panic that must be happening inside that Olmos Park house, the frantic conversations, the tears, the way a woman who'd built something beautiful suddenly felt it all becoming fragile in her hands. He'd seen it before. He knew exactly what it looked like. Then the alerts started coming in and the expression on his face changed. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't quiet. She wasn't panicking. Her name was trending and none of the articles were framed the way he needed them to be framed. The language was wrong. The tone was wrong. People weren't horrified. They were rallying. He refreshed the page, refreshed again. He picked up his phone and called his contact in Dallas, the man who managed his server, his files, his insurance policy. The call went to voicemail. He called again, voicemail. Raven read the trending posts from her car, the same parking garage. She'd gone back there almost without thinking, some muscle memory pulling her to the place where this had started, maybe because she needed to finish it in the same space it began. She scrolled through the comments. Some of them were ugly. She'd expected ugly. Ugly was part of the terrain. But there were hundreds, then thousands of women in those comment sections who were telling their own versions of the same story. Different names, different cities, same math. Same impossible moment when survival and dignity stopped being things you could afford to have at the same time. She put her phone down on the passenger seat, stared through the windshield. Then she laughed. She picked the phone back up and called Simone. "They leaked it early," Raven said. "I know. They handed me the microphone before I was scheduled to have it." "I know," Simone said. "So I'm going to talk louder." She was already opening her camera. "Don't call me for the next 10 minutes. She didn't set up a ring light, didn't fix her hair, didn't change out of the oversized shirt she'd driven over in. She pressed record in the front seat of her car, with the parking garage fluorescents doing nothing flattering for her at all, and she looked directly into the camera like she was talking to one person she trusted completely. "So apparently I went viral this morning," she said, "and nobody even sent me a gift basket. San Antonio, we genuinely need to talk about hospitality." She paused for exactly 1 beat, the way she always did when she was about to pivot. "My name is Raven Jonesley. I grew up on the east side of this city, and I want to tell you something about myself that someone else was planning to tell you first. I'd rather you hear it from me." She talked for 8 minutes. She didn't use notes. She didn't stumble. She spoke the way she'd spoken to Jung-kook the night she told him everything, clearly, steadily, with her eyes open. She talked about her mother working doubles, about the siblings she helped raise, about the scholarship that covered tuition, but not everything else that life costs, about the 8 months at Mirage, and the woman at the door who said we're all just surviving, and the way those words had carried her through more dark moments than any inspirational quote she'd ever read. And then she talked about Damon, not with the trembling voice of someone finally releasing a secret, with the flat, precise voice of someone describing a system they'd studied. She explained what he did. The filming without consent, the way he'd constructed a relationship designed to create material, the way he'd leveraged that material as a leash long after the relationship ended. She said his name, clearly twice. Then she said the thing that broke the internet. The man who has been threatening me for the last 48 hours assumed my husband didn't know my story. He assumed that revealing my past to Lee Jung-kook would destroy my marriage. She tilted her head slightly. That is honestly the funniest assumption anyone has ever made about my husband. Jung-kook knew everything before he proposed. He knew before we got engaged. He knew, and he asked me what my siblings' names were. She let that sit for 3 seconds. The only thing my past could take from me was my own peace. I decided 2 nights ago that it couldn't have that either. So here we are. She stopped recording, posted it before she could think twice. Then she sat back and ate the second half of a taco she'd left on the passenger seat because she had not eaten since yesterday afternoon, and her body was not interested in emotional symbolism right now. It was interested in food. If you're watching this right now and you're wondering how this ends for Damon, stay with me, because it gets so much worse for him than you're imagining. Like the video, drop a comment and subscribe. The video hit 1 million views before noon. The comment section was a war zone for the first 2 hours, the way the internet always is when a woman tells the truth publicly. And then something shifted. The ugly comments were still there, but they were being buried. Women were posting in threads beneath the video, dozens and then hundreds of them, not about Raven specifically, but about the particular shape of the situation she'd described. The impossible math. The decision made alone in the middle of the night with no good options. The shame that attached itself like a second skin and stayed long after the situation that created it was over. A journalist at a national outlet called Simone at 10 a.m. By 11, 2 more had called. By noon, Damon Wyatt's name was attached to a developing story that had nothing to do with Raven. Journalists who'd been investigating the broader landscape of non-consensual intimate image abuse had a thread they'd been waiting to pull, and Raven's video gave them the public moment they needed to pull it. His Dallas LLC appeared in 3 separate articles by end of day. His name, his history, his pattern. His phone had not stopped ringing since morning. Not with calls he wanted. With calls from journalists, from lawyers, from people whose names he recognized as former associates who were now clearly measuring the distance between themselves and him and deciding it wasn't far enough. His contact in Dallas still hadn't called back. He didn't know it yet, but that call was never coming. The man in Dallas had spent the morning being very cooperative with 2 federal investigators who had questions about the server and everything on it. Damon sat in his Pearl District hotel room and tried to think. He was a man who was very good at thinking when he had leverage. Without it, he discovered the thinking was harder. He had 1 move left. It was a bad move. He knew it was a bad move. He made it anyway, because bad options are still options, and he had run out of everything else. He drove to Olmos Park. He knocked on the front door at 8 p.m. like he had any right to be there. The door opened. Jung-kook stood in the frame, no jacket. Calm in the specific way that isn't peace. It's the calm of a man who has already finished the chess game in his head and is waiting for the other person to figure out they've lost. Damon looked at him. Whatever he'd expected, this wasn't it. He'd built an entire psychological operation around the assumption that Jung-kook was a variable. A man with a reputation to protect, a family's expectations to manage, a social architecture that required a certain kind of wife. He'd expected defensiveness, distance, the particular brittleness of a powerful man suddenly unsure of something he'd taken for granted. Jung-kook looked back at him with the expression of someone watching a situation that had already concluded. The silence stretched to 10 seconds, then 15. Damon felt the first real crawl of something cold in his chest. Jung-kook stepped back from the door, not a welcome, an invitation to see. Damon looked past him into the hallway, through to the living room. 3 people he didn't recognize sat in chairs arranged with the unhurried geometry of a room that had been prepared. Two women on the couch. He recognized them in the gut-dropping way you recognize things you've tried to forget. A phone on the coffee table with a call already in progress, the line open. Three men in suits near the window who had the specific quietness of lawyers. The entire room was watching the door. Jung-kook said, "You can come in, or you can leave. Either way, tomorrow looks the same for you." Damon's mouth was dry. He stepped inside. He tried the only thing he had left. He told them he still had the files, that the videos existed, the photos existed, and he would release all of it tonight if they didn't give him a way out of this. He said it with the confidence of a man holding a weapon. Jung-kook looked at him for a moment. Then he turned and looked toward the kitchen doorway. Raven walked out. She was holding 2 glasses of water. She set one on the table in front of Damon, like she was hosting a dinner party that he hadn't been invited to, and she was being gracious about it anyway. She sat down across from him and looked him in the eye. "The files are gone, Damon," she said. "Jung-kook's security team located your server 3 days ago. It's been flagged as evidence in a federal investigation. You don't have access to it. You haven't had access to it since Tuesday. You've been bluffing with an empty hand for 48 hours." She watched him process that. "The 2 women behind you," she continued, "you know them, and they know you well enough to testify in detail. And me?" She leaned forward slightly. "I already told my story this morning. 12 million people watched it before dinner. You have nothing left to sell." The room was completely silent. Damon looked at the women on the couch, looked at the lawyers, looked at the phone on the table, looked at Jung-kook standing near the door, unhurried, watching with that same unreadable calm. And Raven sat across from him, looking the way she always looked when she'd already won something. Not triumphant, just settled. Like the outcome had never really been in question, and she'd been waiting for him to figure that out. Damon Wyatt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, had nothing to say. He left without a word. Just stood up from the chair, looked around the room one more time, like he was hoping something had changed, and walked out the front door. Nobody stopped him, nobody needed to. The lawyers would handle the paperwork. The federal investigators had everything they needed. The 2 women on the couch had already given statements. The door closed behind him and the room breathed. One of the lawyers said something quiet to Jung-kook. Jung-kook nodded. The logistics would continue without them, calls to make, documents to file, a process that would run its course over the coming weeks and months. That part was handled. Raven sat in the chair for a moment after everyone started moving. She looked at her hands on the table. There was a slight tremor in her left hand that she hadn't let herself notice until right now, because there'd been no room for it. The body keeps score even when you're too busy to pay attention. She pressed her palm flat against the table until it stopped. Jung-kook came back into the room. After seeing the lawyers to the door, he looked at her hand. He didn't say anything about it. He pulled up a chair and sat beside her. "You okay?" he asked. "I will be," she said. "Right now I'm just very tired." He nodded. He understood the specific tiredness of a long-running thing finally ending. He'd watched his own father run a company for 30 years, and he'd seen what the end of sustained tension looked like in a person's body when they finally released it. It wasn't dramatic, it was just this, a woman pressing her hand flat against a table and breathing. They sat there for a while without talking. Then Raven said, "I want to go outside." The back porch was her favorite part of the house. She'd known it was her favorite the first time she'd walked through the property. Before she'd even looked at the kitchen or the bedrooms, she'd stepped through the back door and stood in the yard and said, "This is the one." Jung-kook had been looking at the square footage. She'd been looking at the sky. They sat in the 2 chairs she'd bought from a woman on the east side who made them herself, wide, low, solid, the kind of chairs that held you instead of just supporting you. The San Antonio night was warm in the way it gets in late spring, the air carrying something floral from the neighbor's yard 2 houses down. Crickets were doing their thing. Raven had her knees pulled up. Jung-kook had his hands loose in his lap. They'd been married 3 years, and they'd learned each other's silences well enough that this one was comfortable. Not empty, just full of things that didn't need words yet. It was Jung-kook who spoke first. "I watched your video," he said. "The one from the parking garage. I know you did. I watched it 4 times. She looked over at him, his face in profile looking out at the yard. Something there that she hadn't seen during the entire 48 hours, a loosening. Like something he'd been holding had finally put itself down. The 3rd time I watched it," he said, "I heard something I'd missed the first 2 times. She waited. The way you explained your past," he said. "Even in that video, even after everything, you were still making a case. Still explaining why the choices made sense. Still building an argument for why you deserve to be understood." He paused. "Like you were still in a courtroom, like the verdict wasn't in." Raven didn't say anything. "I thought," he continued, "that if I protected you from him, that would be enough. That if the threat was removed, the fear would go with it." He shook his head slightly. "But the fear wasn't of him, not really. It was older than him." She was very still. "You still believed," he said quietly, "that your past could take me from you, even now, even after 3 years. The night was warm and the crickets were loud, and Raven sat with that sentence for a long time. Because it was true, she knew it was true the moment he said it. She'd known it and not known it simultaneously for years. The way you can understand something intellectually and still carry the wound underneath the understanding. She'd told herself she was healed. She'd told herself the past was the past. She'd built the life and earned the success and loved the man and meant every bit of it. And still, somewhere in the architecture of who she was, there was a door she'd never fully unlocked. A room where a younger version of herself still sat in that parking garage eating a taco alone, wondering on some cellular level if the good thing was going to last. "I practiced the conversation where you left," she said. Her voice was steady. She'd said harder things out loud today. "I practiced it so many times I could do it from memory. What I'd tell my mom, how I'd explain it to Kev. I had the whole thing ready." Jung-kook looked at her, and he said she almost laughed. "And you asked me what my brother's name was," she said. "Ruined the whole rehearsal." He reached over and took her hand, not a gesture, not a statement. He just took her hand the way people do when they've been holding the same hand long enough that it's reflex, that it's just the natural continuation of being near each other. "I should have asked you directly," he said, "about the part where you still didn't believe it. I saw it, and I thought protecting you from external threats would fix the internal ones. That was," he paused, choosing the word carefully, "that was me being efficient when I should have been present. I'm sorry." She turned and looked at him fully. "You flew to San Antonio and bought 50 car wash tickets from my little brother," she said. He was very persuasive. "You sat at my mother's table and ate store-brand cookies and didn't make a face." "They were good cookies, Jung-kook." He looked at her. "Every version," she said, not quoting him back to himself, just saying the thing she finally actually believed. "You meant that." "I meant that," he said. She leaned her head back and looked at the San Antonio sky. Not many stars, the city light ate most of them, but enough. A few that had burned long enough to be visible anyway. "I'm going to need you to stop being perfect for like 5 minutes," she said. "It's making it very hard to be the emotionally complex one." He laughed. She'd always loved his laugh because he didn't do it for performance. It just happened when something got him, this pure, unguarded thing that he clearly hadn't been raised to do publicly and had learned to do around her. She'd take credit for that, she'd earned it. They sat on the back porch until midnight, talking sometimes, quiet sometimes. Her mother had called twice during the day. Carol had watched the video and cried in the way she sometimes cried, silently, and then called to say, "I'm proud of you, baby, I'm so proud of you." And Raven had promised to come over for Sunday dinner. Her brother Kev had texted, "Tell Jung-kook I have more car wash tickets." Simone had sent a voice note that was mostly incomprehensible because she was talking too fast and apparently celebrating. Life was coming back to room temperature. And Raven sat on her back porch in Olmos Park and let it. In the weeks that followed, things moved the way legal and public processes move. Steadily, without drama, in ways that don't look like justice while they're happening, but that add up to it eventually. Damon Wyatt was formally charged 6 weeks after that night. The federal investigation into the Dallas server produced evidence that went well beyond what even Jung-kook's team had known about. Addition to victims, additional material, a financial trail that connected to 2 other men who had been operating similarly in different cities. The story became a story about a system, not just one man. The kind of story that gets a documentary eventually. Cassidy Blake issued a public apology that nobody found convincing, including her. She lost 2 major clients. She did not call Raven directly, which was the correct decision for both of them. The long-form essay ran 3 days after the video as planned in a publication that gave it the front page. It was read by people who would never have found the video. It reached into different rooms, different conversations, different corners of the country, where women who'd made impossible choices in impossible circumstances read it on their phones and felt for a moment slightly less alone. Raven did the podcast. It ran long. The host had planned for an hour, and it went nearly 2, and by the end of it they were both crying, though Raven made a joke about it that made them both laugh instead, which was more useful. The 2 women who had spoken on record in Raven's living room gave full interviews. Their names were Toya and Lena, both in their 30s, both from different cities, both with the same specific look in their eyes that Raven recognized. The look of someone who'd been carrying something heavy for so long that the act of finally putting it down felt disorienting, like their bodies didn't know how to stand up straight without the weight anymore. Toya said in her interview that she'd spent 4 years paying Damon in various amounts whenever he resurfaced, that she'd convinced herself each payment was the last one, that she'd built an entirely separate financial structure, a secret account her husband didn't know about, funds pulled from her business income to manage it, that the shame of the original situation had become a smaller thing over time, but the shame of the ongoing payments had grown until it was the thing she thought about every morning when she woke up. The worst part, Toya said, wasn't him. It was that I started to believe I deserved it. Raven read the interview in her office and had to close her laptop for 10 minutes. Then she opened it back up and kept working, because that was what she did. He thought he could destroy her with her past. He never knew her past was exactly what made her impossible to destroy. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.